Everyone has heard that story that the Europeans arrived in the Americas and suddenly subdued millions of indigenous people, thanks to their technological superiority for having gunpowder, swords, diseases, and horses. Even if there was some superiority, how couldn't millions of natives stop a few hundred conquistadors? How did conquistadors conquer the interior while facing exotic animals, with poisoned arrows and the natives' full knowledge of the terrain? How did the rustic firearm, which took minutes to reload, overcome poisoned arrows in the jungle? In today's video, we're going to dismantle the myth of the super powerful conqueror and reveal the alliances, contradictions, and indigenous interests that can help explain how so few Europeans conquered the American continent. When we study the Portuguese and Spanish conquest of the Americas, we are immediately presented with a harsh reality: hundreds of Europeans landing on foreign lands and enslaving and imprisoning natives, thanks to their military superiority and the terrible diseases they brought with them. This idea often arises due to Colombo's terrible experience with the Taínos of the Caribbean islands, and to the reports from Spanish priests, which even led to reprimands from the Spanish crown. But if the Europeans managed to conquer the continental American territory, it was thanks to a large number of alliances made by the conquerors with the natives. Although we usually refer to the indigenous people as a uniform mass, in the Americas, there was constant fighting among various tribes. And some points that are rarely mentioned involve not only the constant wars among the natives, but also the widespread practice of slavery among the indigenous people. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean on his first voyage, he already described this reality among the Taíno people. According to the navigator, many of the men I have seen have scars on their bodies, and when I made signs to them to find out how this happened, they said people from nearby islands tried to capture them, and they defended themselves as best they could. I believe that people from the mainland come here to take them as slaves. That is, the natives from neighboring islands enslaved the natives of Hispaniola in Brazil. In turn, the Portuguese allied themselves with the Tupiniquim, who were already enslaving their Tamoyo enemies, and were also enslaved by their enemies. In fact, Fort Coligny in French Antarctica was built with Tupiniquim labor enslaved by the Tamoyos. In Mexico, Hernán Cortes was given an enslaved indigenous woman named Malinche by other Indians, and this slave, who would become Doña Marina, helped the Spanish in the conquest as a translator. The Incas in Peru, like their predecessors, did not practice slavery, but rather a labor tax called mita, which was later maintained by the Spanish after Francisco Pizarro's conquest. So faced with this reality, one of the main ways Europeans used to get closer to a tribe was precisely by offering military and logistical support. In general, by presenting the new weapon of war that would help that tribe fight against their enemies. The Spaniards knew how to take good advantage of this. In the conquest of Mexico, Hernán Cortés led a small army of Spaniards, but they were accompanied by a large army of indigenous people, Texcocanos, Tlaxcaltecas, and Totonacas, who were enemies of the Aztecs, and some of them had to pay tribute to the Aztecs, with people being sent as prisoners to be sacrificed in their rituals. And it was thanks to this large indigenous army assembled by Cortés that the Spaniards were able to take over Tenochtitlan. Similarly, the Portuguese allied with the Tupiniquins against the Tamboyos in São Paulo, and with the Tabajaras against the Cariris in Pernambuco. And if it weren't for these alliances and understandings made with the natives, the conquerors wouldn't have been able to prosper in these lands. That's because, even though the use of cavalry and cannons made a big difference in open fields, in the forest, the quick attack of arrows was deadly. Precisely because of this, when the natives were not in disagreement or were completely hostile to the Portuguese and Spanish, the result was disastrous. We have as an example the attempt to found the city of Buenos Aires by Juan Díaz de Solís in 1516, which ended in a complete fiasco. With the Spanish expeditionaries being devoured by Guarani Indians shortly afterwards, we also have the case of Francisco Hernández de Córdoba, who, after landing in Yucatan and visiting some cities, Maya Chontal was repelled in the city of Champoton, and the Spaniards had to run to their boats to avoid being wiped out. In fact, the conqueror himself, the leader of the expedition, would die shortly afterwards due to his injuries. Another famous case is that of the conqueror of Chile, Pedro de Valdivia. He met his end by watching his own forearms being torn off and eaten in front of him by the Mapuche Indians. Before being killed, he, along with the captured priest. Similar cases occurred in Brazil as well. Francisco Pereira Coutinho, one of the hereditary captaincy grantees, was killed and eaten in a cannibalistic ritual. Fernão de Sá, son of Mendes Sá, was killed by Indians in the Aimore Wars, and also Estacio de Sá, who was struck by a poisoned arrow in the eye during a battle against the Tamoyos. Precisely because of this, whenever the Spanish won a battle against the natives, they would quickly use a display of their power to win the tribe's alliance against their enemies. For example, Hernán Cortes gained the Chontal Mayas' friendship after defeating them at the Battle of Xentla. Instead of subjugating them, he freed the prisoners and made an effort to befriend the defeated chief, offering himself as an important ally against the chief's enemies. Cortes knew that waging a long-term war, fighting alone against millions of indigenous people, would be deadly. And that's why he used and abused diplomacy to build a formidable indigenous army for himself. But if it's a mistake to think that the natives were united, it's also a mistake to think that all the Europeans were always in agreement. Among the Spaniards, numerous conflicts arose between the conquistadors because of the ambition behind their ventures. Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the discoverer of the Pacific Ocean, was betrayed by his own father-in-law after leading expeditions to map the ocean's coast. Being unjustly accused of treason, he was denied the right to a trial and ended up being executed publicly. Hernán Cortés's conquest of Mexico was an illegal expedition done without the approval of Cuba's governor, Diego Velázquez de Cuellar. Even at the height of the conquest, when Cortés was already inside Tenochtitlan, imprisoning Montezuma, he had to leave the city to fight the troops of the governor, who had landed on the coast with the mission to stop his conquest. During the conquest of Peru, conflict between Francisco Pizarro and Diego de Almagro led to the Battle of Las Salinas, fought among the Spanish conquerors. And, interestingly, Almagro would be killed under Pizarro's orders, and later Almagro's supporters would ambush and kill the conqueror of Peru, who, already quite old at 70 years of age, still managed to kill 3 before finally being killed. And, besides problems among themselves, the conquistadors also often had problems with members of the church. In Brazil, Bishop Sardinha comes into conflict with the authoritarianism of the governor-general's son, and when he goes to Portugal to formally present a complaint, he ends up shipwrecked and being devoured by the Caite Indians. Figures like Bartolomé de las Casas and Friar Domingo de Montesinos also denounced conquistador abuses, acting as protectors of the Indians. Against the Spaniards, including through the Valladolid controversy, King Charles I ordered the conquest to be halted until its morality could be decided by Spanish theologians, with Bartolomé de las Casas and Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda as rivals. It is seen as Europe's first moral debate and first human rights defense. And in this reality, where not even the conquerors were necessarily united, friendship with the natives proved to be even more essential. And the strengthening of ties happened especially through arranged marriages, in order to seal alliances in the Hispanic world. We have as an example the marriage between the Inca Princess Beatriz de Claracoya and Martín García de Loyola, governor of Chile. Just like Francisco Pizarro, who married the Inca Princess Quispe and after Francisco Pizarro's death, she would marry another conqueror, Francisco de Ampoero. In Brazil, Geronimo de Albuquerque married the indigenous woman Muira Ubi and helped pacify Pernambuco, turning the Tabajaras into Portuguese allies. Also, there were castaways like Caramuru, who married the indigenous woman Paraguaçu. Interracial marriage was encouraged by King Fernando of Aragon through the Royal Decree of 1514. Through this document, not only did marriage become more frequent, but widows were also not left helpless in cases of their husband's death. If a conquistador lived with an indigenous woman without marrying her, she would inherit nothing when he died, even if they had children. And, to make sure this didn't happen, some conquistadors even married their concubines to other men, just so they could inherit land and titles. This was true for Malinche, who was a translator and central to the conquest of Mexico. After living for years with Hernán Cortes, she had her marriage arranged with Juan Jaramillo de Andrade, and that way, she was able to secure property and social status. Isabel, daughter of Montezuma, in turn, was married to 3 different Spanish conquistadors, inheriting their properties. And later, the kings of Castile even created a duchy called the Duchy of Montezuma de Tultengo, and the heirs of Montezuma are still nobles in Spain to this day. And beyond convenience, many marriages were happy. Consider the conquistador Alonso Orreda, who was among the first to settle in what is now Venezuela, and he married the native woman renamed Isabel, with whom he had 3 children. When he died, his native wife was so sad that she died a few days later, embracing her husband's grave. And this is represented by a statue in Alonso Orreda Square in the city of Maracaibo. And this permission for marriage by the Iberians is something that contrasts greatly with the policy adopted by the English. Interracial marriage was only legally permitted in the United States a little over 50 years ago, whereas in Spanish and Portuguese America, it was practiced and encouraged for over 500 years. Whereas in England, a society based on social Darwinism was promoted, with indigenous peoples considered enemies. In Spanish and Portuguese America, the descendants of the indigenous people held positions in universities, noble titles, and government offices. Because of this, Spanish and Portuguese America remains very mixed and integrated, unlike English colonized America. And beyond marriages, another strategy used by the Iberians to consolidate alliances was through the distribution of titles and positions of nobility to indigenous leaders in Portuguese America. This remained constant during wartime, with indigenous people like Felipe, Camarão, Arariboya wearing the Order of Christ habit, and others such as Felipe de Souza and Castro, and the Ibiapaba indigenous people, dressed in the Order of Santiago habit. In Spanish America, it also happened with the granting of titles to indigenous people, like the case of Nicolás de San Luis Montañez, who was a native chief of Tula and colonizer of the Cataro Valley, and who was ordained as a Knight of the Order of Santiago. And another example is Andrés de Tapia Montelchel, appointed by Cortes as ruler of Tenochtitlan, who died in battle alongside the Spanish while trying to conquer the Chichimecas. Dom Marcos Tincuatopa, who was of Inca nobility, was Marquis of Oropesa and chief of Coquepata. So what we can observe is that the conquest of America is full of contradictions, alliances, and diverse interests. Unlike the myth of the noble savage, spread by the French, in which the natives didn't know what was happening and lived in peace and harmony, the Native Americans actively participated in the conquest and in strategic alliances with the conquerors, including in the attempts to invade Brazil. Tribes opposed to the Portuguese allied with the Dutch and French against them. When we look at history through the right lens, we see that alliances, marriages, titles, and betrayals weighed much more than swords, gunpowder, or diseases. And maybe in the end, the conquerors didn't win just because they were stronger, but because they knew better than anyone how to play with the interests of the natives who took part alongside them in the conquests, but who were often deliberately left out of history to support a narrative focused only on the simple conflict between Europeans and Indians. Something that a little reflection can already undo. Did you know the details of the conquest? What surprised you most? Leave a comment to support us and consider becoming a channel member now. That way you can explore and learn even more about fascinating Iberian history.